In a small, picturesque village nestled between rolling hills and winding rivers, lived a young woman named Clara. She was known for her gentle smile, her kindness, and her unwavering optimism, despite the challenges life had thrown her way. Clara came from humble beginnings, growing up in a modest home with her parents and two younger siblings. Though they were not wealthy, they shared a deep bond of love and support, a family that stood together through thick and thin. Clara, now in her mid-20s, had married young. Her husband, Daniel, was the love of her life. At least, that's what she had once believed. Daniel had swept her off her feet with his charming words, his smooth mannerisms, and the way he made her feel as though she was the only woman in the world. It wasn't long before they were married in a small, intimate ceremony attended by close friends and family. Clara had dreams of a happy life together with Daniel, where love would be enough to see them through any storm. In the beginning, they were happy. They didn't have much, but they had each other. Daniel worked as a craftsman, making furniture for the local townspeople. His work was admired for its quality, but in such a small village, there was only so much demand. Clara, on the other hand, worked in the village bakery, waking up before dawn each day to bake bread and pastries that filled the streets with the sweet smell of warmth and comfort. It was hard work, but she didn't mind. After all, every loaf of bread sold meant another meal on their table, another day of survival in a world that often felt unforgiving. Despite the modest life they led, Clara was content. She found joy in the little things, the laughter they shared over a simple dinner, the way Daniel would hold her hand as they walked through the village square, and the dreams they spoke of late at night, lying side by side in their small bed. They had always talked about building a future together, one where they might one day have children and perhaps even save enough to buy a small piece of land where they could grow their own food. But as the years went by, something began to shift. Daniel's once loving gaze became distant, his words less tender. Clara couldn't quite place when it had started, but she could feel it in her bones. Their love was unraveling at the seams. The spark that had once ignited their passion seemed to have faded, replaced by something cold and unfamiliar. Daniel had begun to complain more frequently. He spoke of their financial struggles, how they were always just scraping by. The pressure of living paycheck to paycheck weighed heavily on him, and he began to express frustration with their situation. Clara tried to comfort him, reminding him that they had each other, that their love was more valuable than any material wealth. But Daniel's mind had already started to wander, his thoughts consumed by the idea that there was more to life than the meager existence they were living. It wasn't long before Daniel's dissatisfaction turned into resentment. He would come home late, sometimes not at all, with vague excuses about work or meetings with potential clients. Clara could sense that something was wrong, but she chose to trust him, to believe that he was still the man she had fallen in love with. After all, marriage was built on trust, and she wasn't ready to give up on theirs just yet. However, the village was small, and whispers spread quickly. Clara began to hear rumors, hushed voices that spoke of Daniel spending time with another woman, a woman of wealth and status, someone who could offer him the life of luxury that Clara never could. At first, Clara dismissed the rumors as idle gossip. She knew her husband, or at least she thought she did. But as the days turned into weeks and Daniel's behavior grew more erratic, the rumors became impossible to ignore. One evening, after waiting hours for Daniel to return home, Clara decided to confront him. When he finally walked through the door, the smell of expensive perfume clinging to his clothes, she asked him directly, "Daniel, where have you been? What's happening to us?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her with a mixture of guilt and frustration, as if he had been caught in a lie, but was too tired to deny it any longer. "Clara," he began, his voice strained, "I can't keep living like this. We're stuck, and I feel like I'm suffocating. There's more to life than struggling day after day just to make ends meet." Clara's heart sank. She had known something was wrong, but hearing the words from his mouth was like a dagger to her chest. "We've always struggled," she replied, her voice trembling. "But we've always had each other. Isn't that enough?" Daniel sighed heavily and ran a hand through his hair, avoiding her gaze. "It used to be," he admitted. "But things change, Clara. People change. I want more. I want a life where I don't have to worry about every penny, where I can live comfortably, where I can be free. The truth was out, and it hit Clara like a tidal wave. Daniel wasn't just unhappy. He was ready to leave her, to abandon their life together for something, or rather someone else. The realization left her reeling. But even in the face of such betrayal, Clara tried to hold on. She reached out to him, her eyes pleading. "We can make it work, Daniel. We've always found a way before. Don't give up on us now." But Daniel had already made up his mind. He gently pulled away from her grasp, his expression one of resignation. "I'm sorry, Clara. I've met someone else. She can give me the life I've always dreamed of, the life I deserve." Clara felt as though the ground had been ripped out from beneath her. The man she had loved, the man she had built her life with, was leaving her because she wasn't enough, because she was poor. The words cut deep, deeper than any wound she had ever known. She had given him everything she had, her heart, her loyalty, her trust, and in return, he was abandoning her for a wealthier woman, someone who could offer him the material things that Clara never could. In that moment, Clara realized that the man standing before her was not the same man she had married. Daniel had become someone else, someone who valued money and status over love and commitment. She had always known that their life was difficult, that they didn't have the luxuries other couples might have, but she had never imagined that it would drive them apart. Daniel packed his things that night. He didn't say much as he gathered his belongings, and Clara didn't try to stop him. She had already lost him. As she watched him walk out the door, disappearing into the night, Clara felt a mixture of sorrow and anger. How could he leave her like this? How could he turn his back on everything they had built together just because of money? In the days that followed, Clara tried to put on a brave face. She went to work at the bakery as usual, kneading dough and serving customers with a forced smile. But inside, she was broken. The love of her life had left her because she was poor, and the weight of that betrayal was almost too much to bear. The village, of course, was abuzz with gossip. Everyone knew what had happened, and Clara could feel their pitying glances as she walked through the streets. She hated being the subject of their whispers, but there was little she could do to escape it. Her friends tried to comfort her, telling her that Daniel wasn't worth her tears, that she was better off without him. But their words rang hollow. How could they understand the depth of her pain? How could they know what it was like to be cast aside so easily, as if her love meant nothing? Despite everything, Clara refused to give in to despair. She had always been resilient, and she wasn't going to let Daniel's betrayal destroy her. She would move on, somehow. She would find a way to rebuild her life, even if it felt impossible in the moment. And so, she pushed forward, one day at a time, clinging to the hope that better days were ahead, even though the path to them was shrouded in uncertainty. Little did Clara know that her life was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would change everything in ways she could never have imagined. But for now, she was simply a woman abandoned, left behind because she didn't have enough money to keep the man she loved by her side. And though it hurt more than words could express, Clara was stronger than she realized. The night Daniel left, a bitter chill settled over the small village. It was as though the entire world sensed the weight of Clara's heartbreak. She sat alone in their modest home, staring blankly at the door Daniel had just walked out of, her body numb from the emotional storm that had torn through her life. The once warm and lively house now felt cold, empty, like a hollow shell of the life they had built together. She could hardly believe it. The man she had trusted with her heart, her future, had just left her because she wasn't enough for him anymore. Or rather, because her money wasn't enough. How could it come to this? Clara's mind raced with the memories of their life together, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when everything had gone wrong. Was it the long hours he had started spending away from home? Was it the subtle but cruel comments he had made about her inability to provide the luxuries he seemed to crave more and more? Or had it started long before that, buried deep in the dissatisfaction that had festered in Daniel's heart? Clara had known that they were struggling financially. The bakery didn't bring in much, and Daniel's furniture business was barely keeping them afloat. She had thought they were a team, working together to face the hardships life threw at them. They had always done that. But Daniel's heart had drifted far from the promises they had made on their wedding day. He had made a choice to pursue wealth, comfort, and status over their love. What Clara hadn't known, what she hadn't even dared to imagine, was that Daniel's betrayal had begun long before he packed his bags that night. The whispers in the village, the knowing looks she had received over the past few weeks, those were signs of something far worse than just discontent. Daniel hadn't just decided to leave her for a wealthier life. He had already been living part of that life with someone else. Her name was Isabel, and she was everything Clara wasn't. Rich, elegant, and dripping with sophistication, Isabel came from one of the wealthiest families in the region. She had a way of commanding attention without even trying, a presence that seemed to intoxicate people, especially men. For someone like Daniel, who had grown tired of the constant struggle for survival, she must have seemed like a dream come true. Isabel represented the life he thought he deserved, a life free from the constraints of poverty, a life of luxury that Clara could never provide. Clara had heard about Isabel before, of course. Everyone in the village knew who she was. They all spoke in hushed tones about her lavish lifestyle, her frequent trips to the city, and the endless stream of suitors who pursued her, hoping to win her hand and her fortune. But what Clara had never expected was that Daniel, her Daniel, would become one of those suitors. The man who had once promised to love her through better or worse, rich or poor, had been seduced by the allure of wealth and prestige. It wasn't long before Clara began to piece together the timeline of Daniel's infidelity. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the growing distance between them, it all made sense now. While Clara had been working long hours at the bakery, sacrificing her own needs to keep their household running, Daniel had been sneaking away to spend time with Isabel. He had been wining and dining with her, basking in the luxury that came with being in her presence, while Clara was left in the dark, completely oblivious to the deceit. The betrayal cut deeper than anything Clara had ever experienced. It wasn't just that Daniel had cheated on her. It was that he had chosen to deceive her, to lead a double life, all while letting her believe that their marriage was salvageable. He had been lying to her face, telling her that their struggles were too much to bear, that he was simply unhappy with their financial situation, all while he was secretly indulging in the life he claimed to want. The next few days were a blur for Clara. She barely ate, barely slept, and went about her routine at the bakery in a fog of disbelief and sorrow. The townspeople, ever observant, seemed to know exactly what had happened between her and Daniel. They offered sympathetic smiles and whispered words of comfort, but none of it helped. Nothing could dull the pain of knowing that the man she had devoted her life to had betrayed her in the most humiliating way possible. Clara's anger began to grow, festering alongside her grief. How could Daniel do this to her? How could he throw away everything they had built together just because they didn't have money? Was wealth really worth more to him than their love, their years of shared memories? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that Daniel's betrayal wasn't just about the money. It was about who he had become. Somewhere along the way, Daniel had lost sight of the things that truly mattered. He had become consumed by greed, by the desire to be more than just a simple craftsman living in a small village. And in his pursuit of that false ideal, he had destroyed the one thing that had been real. Their relationship. That it was one thing to leave someone because of irreconcilable differences, but to leave because she was poor, as if her worth was measured solely in the size of her bank account. That was unforgivable. Clara had never imagined that Daniel could be so shallow, so blinded by materialism that he would abandon her for someone who offered him a more comfortable life. But that's exactly what he had done. One particularly rainy afternoon, Clara sat by the window of their now empty house, watching the droplets trickle down the glass. The sound of the rain had always soothed her before, but now it only heightened the sense of loneliness that had taken root in her heart. As the sky darkened and the rain poured harder, Clara allowed herself to finally let go of the tears she had been holding back since Daniel left. She cried for the love she had lost, for the future that had been stolen from her, and for the betrayal that had shattered her trust in the man she thought she knew. It was a release she desperately needed, even though it did little to ease the deep ache in her chest. The pain was raw, and it felt like it would never go away. But as the days passed, Clara began to realize that something was shifting inside her. Yes, she was still heartbroken, and yes, she still felt betrayed. But underneath all of that, there was a growing sense of resolve. Daniel had chosen to leave her because he thought she wasn't enough. He had thrown her away in search of something better. But Clara knew something he didn't, something that would change the course of both of their lives forever. Because while Daniel had been chasing after wealth and luxury with Isabel, Clara had received news that would make his betrayal all the more bitter. Just a few days before Daniel had packed his bags and walked out the door, Clara had received a letter from a distant relative, a great aunt she hadn't seen in years. The letter had been unexpected, a simple note informing her that her great aunt had passed away and left Clara something in her will. At the time, Clara hadn't thought much of it. She hadn't been particularly close to her great aunt, and she assumed that whatever inheritance she had been left would be modest at best. But now, as Clara reread the letter with fresh eyes, she realized that this inheritance was far from modest. Her great aunt had been wealthier than anyone in the family had known. She had owned land, properties, and investments that had grown substantially over the years. And now, all of it was Clara's. The irony wasn't lost on her. Daniel had left her because he thought she was poor, because he believed that wealth and luxury could only be found with someone like Isabel. He had thrown her away, not realizing that the very thing he craved was already within reach. If only he had stayed. Clara could have laughed at the absurdity of it all. Here she was, broken and betrayed, but wealthier than she had ever imagined. And yet, the money didn't bring her joy. It didn't erase the pain of Daniel's abandonment or make her feel any less betrayed. If anything, it only deepened her sense of loss. Because now, with all this newfound wealth, she could see just how shallow Daniel's love had truly been. He hadn't loved her. He had loved what she could provide for him. And when he thought she couldn't provide enough, he had discarded her. The village soon caught wind of Clara's inheritance. Word traveled fast in such a small community, and soon everyone knew that the poor baker's wife had suddenly come into a fortune. People's attitudes towards her began to shift. Those who had once pitied her now looked at her with envy, admiration, and even curiosity. They wanted to know what she would do with her newfound wealth, how she would use it to rebuild her life. But Clara had no interest in flaunting her inheritance. She had no desire to rub it in Daniel's face or to prove anything to the people who had watched her suffer. She simply wanted to move on. And yet, despite her best efforts to distance herself from the past, there was one person who couldn't seem to stay away. Daniel. Word of Clara's inheritance had reached him too, of course. And now, after abandoning her for a wealthier woman, he was trying to worm his way back into her life. That it started with letters. Apologies written in hastily scrawled handwriting, each one more desperate than the last. Daniel wrote about how he had made a terrible mistake, how he had been blinded by greed, how he had realized that Clara was the one he truly loved all along. He begged for her forgiveness, pleaded for another chance to make things right. But Clara knew better. She had seen the truth behind Daniel's words. He didn't love her. He loved the idea of her wealth, the comfort and security it could bring. Just as he had been drawn to Isabel's fortune, he was now drawn to hers. It was painfully clear that Daniel's intentions were not born out of genuine remorse, but out of his own selfish desire to regain the life of luxury he had always wanted. Clara read each letter with a growing sense of detachment. The man who had once been the center of her world was now a stranger to her. A stranger who had betrayed her, used her, and thrown her away without a second thought. And no amount of letters or empty apologies could change that. Daniel's letters soon turned into visits. He would come by the bakery, lingering at the entrance, hoping to catch a glimpse of Clara. At first, she ignored him, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a response. But Daniel was persistent. He continued to show up day after day, until finally, Clara had enough. One afternoon, as Daniel stood outside the bakery, looking lost and pathetic, Clara walked out to meet him. The rain had just begun to fall, a light drizzle that made the cobblestone streets glisten in the fading light. Daniel's eyes lit up when he saw her, and for a moment, he seemed to believe that his persistence had finally paid off. But the look on Clara's face quickly erased any hope he had harbored. "Daniel," Clara said, her voice steady and calm, "you left me. You made a choice to walk out of my life because I wasn't enough for you. You threw away everything we had, and now you expect me to take you back because I have money." Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but Clara held up her hand, silencing him. She wasn't finished. "You didn't love me when I was poor, and you certainly don't love me now. What you love is the idea of being with someone who can provide you with the life you think you deserve. But I see through you, Daniel. You made your choice. You chose money over love, and now you have to live with the consequences of that decision." Daniel's face fell. He looked as though he had been struck, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find the words to respond. But there was nothing he could say that would change the truth of what Clara had just spoken. Without another word, Clara turned and walked away, leaving Daniel standing in the rain, alone with his regrets. That it was a moment of finality, a moment that marked the end of one chapter of Clara's life and the beginning of another. She had been betrayed, yes, but she was no longer the broken woman who had been left behind. She was stronger now, wiser, and ready to take control of her own destiny. And as she walked back into the bakery, the rain falling gently behind her, Clara knew that her story was far from over. Clara sat at the small table in her kitchen, the soft light of the morning filtering through the window. The world outside was still waking up, birds singing in the trees, the distant sounds of the village beginning its daily hum of activity. But Clara's mind was far from the peaceful morning scene in front of her. Her thoughts were consumed by the letter she had just opened, the words of her late great-aunt's lawyer running through her head like an endless loop. It had been a simple envelope, almost inconspicuous, sitting at the bottom of the pile of mail Clara had forgotten to sort through the past few days. She had been avoiding everything: letters, chores, even conversations with her friends. The emotional storm that Daniel had left her in still hung over her, and she was trying her best to get through each day without completely falling apart. But then, out of sheer curiosity, she had opened that one letter, and her world had changed in an instant. The letter informed her that her great-aunt, a distant relative whom Clara hadn't seen since she was a little girl, had passed away. Clara had only vague memories of her, a tall, elegant woman who had always been dressed in luxurious fabrics, with a mysterious air about her. She had lived in a grand house far away from the village, and the family had often whispered about her vast fortune, though no one ever seemed to know the full extent of it. Clara's parents had spoken of her rarely, only mentioning her when prompted, and even then with a sort of quiet respect that bordered on fear. Now, it seemed, that same mysterious great-aunt had left everything to Clara. The lawyer's letter was brief but clear. Clara was the sole beneficiary of her great-aunt's estate, which included not only her grand home, but also a vast sum of money, several properties, and various investments that had accumulated wealth over the years. Clara, a woman who had spent her life scraping by, working long hours in a village bakery, was now an incredibly wealthy heiress. The irony of it all wasn't lost on her. Just days ago, Daniel had walked out on her, claiming that he couldn't bear their life of poverty any longer. He had abandoned her, believing that she was too poor to give him the life he wanted. And now, in a cruel twist of fate, Clara had become wealthier than Daniel could have ever imagined. The very life he had left her to chase after with another woman was now within her grasp. But none of it mattered. None of the money, the properties, or the wealth could erase the pain of his betrayal. That Clara's hands trembled as she reread the letter, trying to make sense of everything. Her great-aunt had never been close to her, had never even hinted at the possibility of leaving her anything, let alone a fortune. Why her? Why now? And what was she supposed to do with all this wealth? For a moment, she felt overwhelmed. The weight of the inheritance felt like an anchor pulling her down rather than a blessing lifting her up. It was too much, too soon, and in the wake of Daniel's abandonment, it felt like a cruel joke. How could life be so unfair? How could Daniel leave her because she wasn't rich enough, only for her to inherit a fortune just days later? But as the shock began to fade, Clara's mind turned to more practical matters. She needed to meet with the lawyer, to sort through the details of her great-aunt's estate, and to understand just how much her life was about to change. She couldn't sit here in disbelief forever. There were things that needed to be done, decisions that needed to be made. And despite the emotional whirlwind she was still caught in, Clara knew that she had to face this new reality head-on. The following week, Clara made the journey to the city to meet with her great-aunt's lawyer. The office was grand, located in a towering building that overlooked the bustling streets below. Clara felt out of place as she walked through the marble lobby, her simple village clothes contrasting sharply with the polished, wealthy professionals who hurried past her. But she held her head high, determined not to let the grandeur of the place intimidate her. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Dawson, greeted her with a warm smile as she entered his office. He was an older man with gray hair and kind eyes, and his demeanor immediately put Clara at ease. He motioned for her to sit down and began to explain the details of the inheritance in a calm, measured tone. As I'm sure you've already read in the letter, Miss Clara, your great-aunt has left you her entire estate, Mr. Dawson began, his voice steady and professional. This includes several properties, a substantial sum of money, and a number of investments that have grown over the years. It is, in every sense of the word, a significant fortune. Clara nodded, though she still felt as though she were in a dream. But why me? She asked, her voice quiet. I barely knew her. We hadn't spoken in years. Mr. Dawson leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together as he considered her question. Your great-aunt was a very private woman. She had no children of her own, and though she had many relatives, it seems she saw something in you that reminded her of herself. In her will, she mentioned that you shared a certain resilience, a strength of spirit that she admired. She believed that you, of all her family, would make the best use of her fortune. Clara blinked in surprise. Strength of spirit? Resilience? She had never thought of herself that way, especially not in recent weeks, as she struggled to pick up the pieces of her life after Daniel's departure. But if her great-aunt had seen something in her, something that she herself couldn't yet see, maybe there was truth in it. Maybe she was stronger than she realized. Mr. Dawson continued, detailing the various assets Clara had inherited. There was the grand estate where her great-aunt had lived, a sprawling mansion with lush gardens and acres of land. There were also several properties in the city, rental homes and apartments that brought in a steady income. And then there was the money, an almost unfathomable amount, enough to ensure that Clara would never have to worry about financial security again. As Mr. Dawson spoke, Clara felt a mixture of emotions wash over her. Gratitude, disbelief, and even a sense of sadness for the great-aunt she had never truly known. But more than anything, she felt a growing sense of determination. This inheritance wasn't just a stroke of luck or a gift from a distant relative. It was a chance for her to start over, to rebuild her life on her own terms. For so long, Clara had defined herself by her relationship with Daniel. She had believed that their love was enough, that their life together, however modest, was all she needed. But Daniel had shown her the painful truth. That love, at least the kind of love he had for her, wasn't enough to withstand the lure of wealth and status. He had chosen to leave her because he thought she was poor, because he believed that his happiness could only be found with someone who could give him the life he wanted. But now, as Clara sat in that grand office, she realized something important. She didn't need Daniel. She never had. She had always been enough, just as she was, even if Daniel hadn't seen it. And now, with this inheritance, she had the means to prove it. Not to him, but to herself. Clara returned to the village with a renewed sense of purpose. The weight of Daniel's betrayal still hung over her, but it no longer consumed her. She had bigger things to focus on now, her future, her life, and the possibilities that lay ahead. The villagers, of course, were abuzz with gossip about Clara's sudden wealth. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about what she should do next. Some suggested that she move to the city, where she could live a life of luxury among the wealthy elite. Others speculated that she would marry a rich suitor, someone who could match her newfound status. But Clara wasn't interested in any of that. She had no desire to chase after the superficial trappings of wealth or to prove herself to anyone. Instead, Clara quietly set about making changes to her life. The first thing she did was sell the bakery. It had been her livelihood for years, But now, with the financial security her inheritance provided, she no longer needed to spend her days working from dawn until dusk. She found a young couple from the village who had always dreamed of owning their own business and sold the bakery to them for a fair price. They were overjoyed, and Clara felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that the bakery would continue to thrive under new ownership. Next, Clara turned her attention to the estate she had inherited. It was a beautiful, sprawling property, but it had fallen into disrepair over the years. Her great-aunt had been a reclusive woman in her later years, and the estate had been neglected as a result. Clara decided to restore it to its former glory, not for the sake of impressing anyone, but because she felt a connection to the place. It was part of her family's history, and she wanted to honor that. She hired a team of workers to begin the restoration process, carefully selecting artisans and craftsmen who shared her vision for the estate. Over the course of several months, the grand house was transformed. The gardens were replanted, the rooms were restored, and the entire property was brought back to life. Clara spent time walking through the gardens, imagining what it would have been like to grow up in such a place. And though the estate still felt like a world away from the humble life she had known, she began to see it as her OW, and as the restoration work continued, Clara also took the time to explore the financial aspects of her inheritance. She met with advisors, learned about investments, and took an active role in managing her assets. She didn't want to be one of those people who inherited wealth only to squander it through mismanagement or ignorance. She wanted to be smart about it, to ensure that her newfound fortune would last for generations to come. But even as Clara embraced her new life, she couldn't completely escape the shadows of her past. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting a warm, golden glow over the village. Clara stood in the garden of her great-aunt's restored estate, gazing out at the meticulously pruned rose bushes and the soft sway of the trees in the evening breeze. The estate was truly magnificent now, restored to its former glory. It had been months of hard work, but seeing the house and grounds come back to life gave Clara a sense of accomplishment and peace. This place had become a reflection of her own transformation, a journey from pain and betrayal to strength and independence. But despite the beauty around her, Clara's thoughts drifted back to a time when life was much simpler, though far from perfect. It was impossible to avoid thinking about Daniel now and again, especially with the village buzzing with rumors of his return. It seemed that after the glamorous life he had left her for didn't quite work out, Daniel had found his way back to the place he once considered too small, too poor, too limiting. The news of his return had been both expected and unwelcome. It was typical of Daniel to return, especially now that Clara was no longer the same woman he had abandoned. She had heard through the village grapevine that things hadn't worked out with Isabel, the woman he'd chosen over her. That relationship had ended in disaster when Isabel's own financial troubles surfaced, leaving Daniel once again chasing the life of comfort he had always desired. Clara had no interest in Daniel's current state of affairs. She had made her peace with his departure, and while the pain of his betrayal had stung for a long time, she had grown from it. Daniel's greed and shallowness had revealed the kind of person he truly was, and Clara had no space in her life for a man like that. However, it seemed that Daniel had different ideas. The IT started with small gestures, a letter or two, arriving at the estate in Daniel's familiar handwriting. The letters were filled with apologies and declarations of regret. He wrote about how leaving her had been the biggest mistake of his life, how he had been blinded by the allure of wealth and status, and how he now realized that none of it meant anything without her. He begged for her forgiveness, asked for another chance, and promised that this time, things would be different. Clara read each letter, and though she felt a sense of vindication seeing Daniel's remorse, the words left her cold. She knew what Daniel really wanted. It wasn't her love or forgiveness. It was her newfound fortune. It was painfully clear that his letters were motivated by the same greed that had driven him away in the first place. He didn't love her. He loved the life he thought she could now provide. Still, Daniel's persistence continued. When Clara didn't respond to his letters, he began to visit the estate, standing at the front gate, hoping for a moment with her. Clara instructed the staff to keep the gates closed to him, and at first she ignored his attempts to see her. But Daniel was nothing if not determined. He showed up regularly, standing in the rain or sun, pleading for her attention. It was as though he believed that if he tried hard enough, Clara would eventually give in. One afternoon, after yet another visit from Daniel, Clara decided that it was time to put an end to his persistence. She couldn't ignore him forever, and perhaps it was time to face the man who had once been such a significant part of her life. So, the next time Daniel appeared at the gate, Clara asked the staff to let him in. As Daniel stepped through the entrance, Clara felt a strange mix of emotions. There was a time when seeing him would have filled her with a complicated combination of love, hurt, and longing. But now, all she felt was a quiet resolve. The man walking toward her was not the same one she had once loved. Or rather, she was not the same woman who had loved him. That version of Clara was gone, and she had no intention of looking back. Daniel approached her cautiously, his face a mixture of desperation and hope. "Clara," he began, his voice soft, almost pleading, "I've missed you. I've thought about you every day since I left. I was a fool, an absolute fool. I don't know how I could have been so blind, but I see it now. I see what a mistake I made." Clara crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "What exactly do you see, Daniel?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. He hesitated, clearly not expecting the cold reception. "I see that you were always the one for me, that I was chasing something that didn't matter. Isabel, she was a mistake. I thought money would make me happy, but it didn't. All it did was show me that what I really needed, what I really wanted, was right here all along." Clara stared at him, her eyes unwavering. "And what was it that you needed, Daniel? Was it me? Or was it the idea of being with someone who has money?" Daniel's face paled slightly, and he shook his head quickly. No, it wasn't about the money. I swear, I've realized that none of that matters. What matters is us. I love you, Clara. I always have." Clara let out a small, humorless laugh. "You love me? Is that what you're telling yourself now? Because the last time you were here, you made it very clear that love wasn't enough for you. You wanted more than I could give, so you left." Daniel's eyes grew desperate, and he reached out as if to take her hand, but Clara stepped back, keeping the distance between them. "I was wrong," he said quickly. "I see that now. I thought I needed a life of luxury, but it didn't bring me happiness. None of it did. Please, Clara, give me another chance. We can start over. I'll be the man you deserve this time. I swear." For a long moment, Clara said nothing. She looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and in that moment, she saw the truth. This man, standing before her, wasn't here because he had suddenly discovered some newfound love for her. He was here because he had lost everything: his life with Isabel, his dreams of wealth, and now he was clinging to her as his last hope. He wasn't sorry for what he had done. He was simply afraid of being left with nothing. "I've already given you a chance, Daniel," Clara said quietly, her voice steady. "I gave you everything I had. I loved you with all my heart, and I believe that you love me too. But when you had the opportunity to choose between love and money, you chose money. You made your choice, and now you have to live with it." Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but Clara continued before he could interrupt. "You didn't love me when I had nothing, and you don't love me now. What you love is the idea of being with someone who can provide you with the life you think you deserve. But I see through you, Daniel. You haven't changed. You're the same man you've always been, selfish, greedy, and willing to betray anyone if it means getting what you want." Daniel's face crumpled, and for a moment, Clara thought she saw genuine regret in his eyes. But it wasn't enough. It could never be enough to undo the hurt he had caused, the betrayal that had nearly broken her. She had fought too hard to rebuild herself, to find strength in the wake of his abandonment. And she wasn't about to let him tear that down now. Without another word, Clara turned and walked away, leaving Daniel standing alone in the garden. The setting sun cast long shadows across the estate, and as she walked toward the house, Clara felt a strange sense of closure. She had faced Daniel, and in doing so, she had finally let go of the last remnants of the life they had once shared. For so long, Clara had believed that her happiness was tied to Daniel, that without him, she would always feel incomplete. But now, as she stepped into the grand foyer of the estate, she realized something important. She was whole on her own. She didn't need Daniel, or anyone else to define her worth. She had built a life for herself, one filled with strength, independence, and purpose. And no one, not even Daniel, could take that away from her. The days that followed were quieter, more peaceful. Daniel stopped coming to the estate, finally accepting that there was no place for him in Clara's life anymore. The villagers, too, seemed to grow tired of gossiping about the situation, and life returned to its normal rhythm. Clara continued to manage the estate, overseeing the final stages of its restoration and learning more about the investments and properties she had inherited. She took pride in her new role, not because of the wealth it brought, but because it gave her a sense of control over her own destiny. For the first time in her life, she was in charge of her future, and she was determined to make the most of it. And yet, despite everything, there was still a part of Clara that wondered what might come next. She had spent so long rebuilding her life after Daniel's betrayal, focusing on the estate and her newfound responsibilities, that she hadn't taken the time to think about her own happiness. Now that Daniel was truly gone, now that she had closed that chapter of her life, she was free to think about what she wanted, what would truly make her happy. Today, as she walked through the estate's gardens one evening, the stars beginning to twinkle in the darkening sky, Clara allowed herself to dream. She dreamed of a life filled with purpose, with love, not the kind of shallow love that Daniel had offered, but something deeper, something real. She dreamed of finding someone who would love her for who she was, not for what she could provide. And most of all, she dreamed of a future that was hers to shape, free from the shadows of the past. Clara smiled to herself as she gazed up at the stars. The future was uncertain, yes, but for the first time in a long time, it was filled with hope. And that was more than enough.